Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture video, DSLR Camera Introduction. So I wanted to start this discussion of photography by explaining what specific camera equipment that you'll be using this semester. You're going to be using a Nikon D7100 DSLR camera with an 18 to 140 millimeter zoom lens and a 35 millimeter fixed focal length lens. In addition to the lenses themselves, you'll also be using an SB700 speedlight, which is a separate flash unit that can be attached to the camera, and you'll have access to an SU800 wireless speedlight commander, which allows the SB700 speedlight to be used wirelessly in conjunction with the camera flash. Now, the goal of this lecture is to help you become familiar with the functions and the uses of each piece of equipment shown here. You will also get the chance to practice with the cameras in small groups during the laboratory activities. Please keep in mind that this equipment is extremely valuable and it should be treated with care at all times. Any negligence, which I'm sure there won't be an issue, but just as a warning, any negligence that causes damage to the camera equipment will result in a grade reduction and may result in removal from the laboratory exercise. So let's start with a discussion about the SLR camera. SLR stands for single lens reflex. Essentially, the picture that you see when you look through the viewfinder is the exact same picture that the camera sees. In the old days, this meant the picture on the film, but nowadays most photography uses digital SLRs, or DSLRs, which use a digital sensor to record the image in place of film. The reflex in SLR camera refers to the use of a mirror system inside the camera to bounce the image from the film plane to the viewfinder itself. That process is shown here in the image on this slide. The green line represents a mirror that rests in front of the red sensor. While you are setting up the picture, the mirror bounces the image onto the viewfinder, shown as the yellow box on the right here. When you press down the shutter to actually take the picture, the mirror flips up and allows the light to pass directly onto the digital sensor. Now, one of the reasons that DSLR cameras are used by professional photographers, including crime scene photographers, is because they have removable lenses. This makes them distinct from the compact cameras that you see in stores and that are used in smart devices. Lenses can be created to address different types of photography so that the camera can be more effectively used for a specific purpose. For example, there are lenses that are specifically designed to capture close-up images. There are also lenses that are specifically designed to capture far-away images. By being able to change out the lenses on the DSLR camera, you can set the camera up to take the best photograph possible in a particular situation by using the right equipment. Now that you understand what an SLR camera is, let's talk more about lenses. Lenses are described using their focal length, and the focal length is shown here. When light enters the camera, it does so in straight lines. The lens is curved, which bends the light rays and focuses the light rays onto a single point. Think of light moving through a prism. The spot where all of the light comes together is the focal point. DSLR lenses have the digital sensor located at the focal point so that the image on the sensor is in focus. The length between the center of the lens and the focal point is the focal length. The focal length is always measured in millimeters. Before I said that there were different lenses available for different shooting situations. Well, the main differences between those lenses are the focal lengths of the lenses. A so-called normal lens is 50 millimeters. This focal length mimics that of our eyes, so the camera sees the picture the same as the naked eye. Wide-angle lenses have focal lengths that are shorter than normal, so less than 50 millimeters. And lenses above 50 millimeters are called telephoto lenses because they have a focal length that is longer than normal. As you can see from the photograph here, the longer the focal length, the less the subject matter that you'll be able to see or to be able to fit into the photograph. That's why the shorter focal lengths are called wide angle. They allow for more pieces of the image to be shown in a normal or a telephoto lens. This is also why when you zoom out of a picture, when you're trying to fit more people in. When you zoom in, you are lengthening the focal length, and therefore you are tightening the area that you can actually fit inside your camera. By zooming out, you're shortening the focal length and you're allowing more of the picture to be seen. Now, this lecture focuses on basic photography principles, but I do want to mention one thing here that's relevant to crime scene photography. In crime scene photography, we always use a normal lens if at all possible. This is because the 50mm lens is the only lens that does not cause measurement distortion within the photograph. Being able to measure correctly in the photograph is particularly important for evidence photography because photographs are often used by analysts for evidence examination and comparison. To make sure that all the measurements are correct, photographs should either be taken using a 50mm lens or they have to be corrected in a digital photography program like Photoshop before being used to compare evidence. For this course, your DSLR camera lens has a small range from wide angle to telephoto. So it's 30 to 100, or to, I have 80 marked here, but I think it's a little bit more than that. So always check what focal length you have it set on before you actually begin taking photographs. Now, like I mentioned previously, digital SLR cameras use a digital sensor to record the image. These sensors use what is called a pixel. A pixel is simply the smallest point in a sensor that can identify color. It's kind of like Minecraft. The smaller the pixel, the more detailed the image is. The larger the pixel, the more boxy the image is, and the less detail that it contains. Now, digital SLRs store their pixels in an image file, and there are a variety of different image file types, but I want to distinguish between something called a compressed file and a raw file. A raw file, RAW, means that all of the pixel details are contained within the file. This creates a relatively large file because it's storing data from thousands of pixels at a time. This is why a lot of times we use what are called compressed files. Now, compressed files mean that the pixel data is altered in some way to make the file size smaller. There are multiple different types of compressed files, but JPEG is probably one of the most common. Because JPEG files are compressed, the camera goes through the pixels in an image and it tries to downsize them by eliminating pixels that are close in color. Notice the photograph here in this slide. These two photos are zoomed into a small section of the photograph. The photograph on the left was saved in a RAW format, which preserves all of the pixel details. Notice that you can see the shadowed patterns in the blue and red shirt in the photograph. The photograph on the right, however, had compressed the pixels into a smaller format. The camera went through and it combined sections of pixels that had similar shading. This causes the pixelation on both shirts, reducing the clarity of the shadowed portions and limiting the overall image quality. The advantage is that JPEGs are much smaller than RAW images, with approximately 1:10 ratio to RAW image size. So a memory card that can hold 1,000 JPEG images can likely store only about 100 RAW images. Realistically, most images are fine to shoot in JPEG. However, if there are images that you will need to zoom into or images that you're concerned about the minute details, like a fingerprint photo, then it's important that you maintain all of the detail present in the photograph. That's why shooting in RAW format can sometimes be more helpful than JPEG. Luckily, memory cards get bigger and cheaper all the time, so this has allowed police departments to store more and more RAW photos onto a single memory card. So let's talk about the actual using your camera to capture images part. Now, I'm going to describe some of the basic procedures here in this lecture, but I've also posted several video guides on my website. I highly encourage you to review these videos because they provide you with more detailed walkthroughs of the camera equipment that you'll be using in this course. First, let's start, let's start with the shooting mode. There are several different shooting modes available on your Nikon camera. There are 5 main options for shooting that you'll use in this course, along with some special effects options that we're not going to get into. I will review each of these modes in more detail in the following slides. On the camera control dial, you will see each mode represented with the symbols shown here. And I do want to say this is specific to Nikon because Canon and some other manufacturers, they have different symbols, so you'll have to learn whatever symbols you have for your individual camera. But the modes themselves tend to be pretty similar. Okay, I want to take a quick pause here to introduce a concept that I'll cover in more depth in a different lecture video, the exposure triangle. But it's important for you to understand the basic exposure settings. So when we're taking photographs, we're trying to optimize the exposure, which is the amount of light that falls on the digital sensor. Exposure is affected by 3 different camera settings: the size of the aperture, which is known as the f-stop, the speed of the shutter, and the ISO of the film or sensor. Each of these settings will affect the amount of light that goes onto the digital sensor. In a digital camera, these settings can be set automatically by the camera sensor, or they can be set manually by the photographer. Each shooting mode of the camera, therefore, influences what exposure settings are automatic and what exposure settings are manual. For this discussion of capturing images, I'm going to explain what modes go with manual control of what settings. We'll get into more detail about how these settings affect the image in more detail in the following lecture video on the exposure triangle. Now, the automatic mode is the most common, but it's also the least helpful for crime scene photography. In the automatic mode, the camera sensors are in charge of controlling everything, and that includes the shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, and whether or not the flash that comes out. The problem with automatic is that the camera reacts to the light in the scene, but it doesn't know to take into account the context of the photograph. For example, there are limits on the shutter speed if you are hand holding the camera versus using a tripod. The automatic mode doesn't take that context into account. So it doesn't compensate for hand holding, and you can easily end up with a blurry photograph. So the best thing to do is to avoid using this mode for crime scene photography. Now, the purpose of the Photography Basics laboratory activity is to help you gain familiarity with the camera and the different settings that are available so that you become comfortable using the camera without relying on automatic mode for the future laboratory activities. Aperture priority mode is one that we use really often in crime scene photography. Denoted by an A in Nikon cameras, aperture priority mode allows you to choose the f-stop that you want. The camera then compensates the other exposure settings automatically to maintain a proper exposure for the image. Shutter priority mode, denoted by an S in Nikon cameras, works the same way, but this time you choose the shutter speed, and then the camera will automatically adjust the aperture and the ISO for proper exposure. These are both helpful modes when all you need is a small adjustment from the automatic exposure settings for a specific context, like hand holding the camera or working in low light conditions. So you want to make a little bit of adjustment and then let the camera handle all the other adjustments to make sure that the exposure and the photograph is exposed properly. Program mode, which is denoted by a P in Nikon cameras, allows you to control two things: the ISO and the flash. Then the camera is going to adjust the other settings automatically. And then finally, manual mode, or full M on your settings dial, allows you to control all of the settings at one time. Manual can be really difficult for the beginning photographer because you're required to identify all of the proper exposure settings yourself. So we don't use manual as much as we use the other modes. One of the great things about digital cameras is that when you're using the camera on a setting other than automatic, the camera sensor can still provide you with important information about the recommended exposure settings before you actually take the photograph. This is called metering. The camera sensor will analyze the light coming into the camera lens, and then it'll recommend an ISO, a shutter speed, and an f-stop for the scene lighting that it senses at the center of the image. To use metering, you want to press the capture button on the camera halfway down. So usually you would go click. This time you would want to go key, a little half down. The camera will then flash the recommended settings at you. So you'll either see those at the bottom of the viewfinder, they'll pop up, or you'll see them on the back screen of the camera, depending on how you have your display settings turned on. Once you know what the recommended settings are, you can then manually adjust the settings from there to compensate for the alterations that you require for context. And we'll talk about that more in the exposure triangle lecture video. In addition to choosing a shooting mode and ensuring a proper exposure, another key element to capturing images is to focus the image. Most of you have experience with automatic focus only, meaning that the camera will look over the scene and try to figure out who the subject is, the distance between the subject and the camera, and then it attempts to focus the subject as best as possible. Now, DSLR cameras are more advanced though, because they allow for both automatic and manual focus. Manual focus can be particularly important for crime scene photography because there are going to be situations in which the camera sensor has a difficult time identifying the subject and getting a proper focus. You've probably experienced this before on your smartphone or your pocket camera. You get ready to take a photo and the camera lens goes in and out, in and out, in and out, but the image keeps remaining blurry. What this means is that the camera is having difficulties identifying the subject, and it's a common problem when you are too close to your subject. Using manual focus, you can use the focus ring on the camera to properly focus the image without relying on the camera sensor. Manual focus is also useful when you encounter difficult lighting solutions like fire scenes and outdoor scenes where those sensors don't work very well. This photograph shows you the side of your Nikon 18 to 140 millimeter lens, which you're going to be using the majority of the time. To change between automatic and manual focus, you're going to move the tab at the base from A, standing for autofocus, to M, manual focus. Also shown in this photograph are the two rings on your lens. The ring closest to the camera base is the focusing ring. That's the smaller ring. The larger ring beyond that is the zoom ring. This ring allows you to select the different focal lengths that are offered by the lens, which in this case run from 18 millimeters wide angle to 140 millimeters telefocal. To focus the photo in manual focus mode, you spin the focusing ring until the image in the viewfinder is in focus to your eyes. One of the tricks that's helpful when manually focusing is that zooming in doesn't affect focus. So zoom in all the way on a subject as close as you can get. That's going to help you focus the image better. Once you focus that image, you can now zoom back out to the desired focal length, and it does not change the focus. Your picture will still be in focus. Since you are using a digital SLR camera, you can also double check your focus by taking the photograph and then on the back display where it shows you your picture, zoom in. If you focus correctly, even a zoomed in look at the photograph won't be blurry. If you haven't focused correctly, then when you zoom in on that back panel, you'll see a lot of blur. And that's telling you you need to try to retake that photo. All right, well that completes this video lecture, everyone. Thanks for watching.